Hello and welcome to this session. This is Professor Farhat. In this session, we would look at examples of how do we account for governmental grant, because we have different type of governmental grant: contingency, unrestricted, restricted with a time purpose, restricted with a specific purpose. So we're going to go ahead and look at this scenario to illustrate some journal entries. So hello and welcome to this session in which we would look at how to account for governmental grant. This is Professor Farhat. Now keep in mind the government might receive different types of grants. Some grants are unrestricted, some are restricted, some are contingent, some are reimbursed. We have different types of grants. Let's go ahead and look at some types of grants and work some journal entries. Columbus City was awarded a state reimbursement grant. So basically this is a reimbursement grant. And what is a reimbursement grant? Reimbursement grant basically state you spend the money for whatever we need to, then we'll reimburse you. So they awarded a grant for $150. Notice they were awarded, they did not send them the money. To assist its adult literacy program. So they want to help the adult literacy population. The following were significant events relating to the grant. The first requirement is prepare the journal entries and the governmental fund. So the city, which is on calendar year, was notified of the award of 2017. So what happened in 2017? We were notified. That's good news. But they did not transfer the cash for us. So all what happened in 2017, we were notified. That's it. Well, what do we need to do in 2017? And the answer is nothing. Okay, because we were just notified. In 2018, the city expended $30,000 on its literacy program and was reimbursed for $20,000 and expected to receive the balance for the remaining of 2019. Now, we spend the money. We spend the money, what's going to happen is we're going to have to debit an expenditure. For how much? For $30,000. Obviously, we incur the expenditure, and we're going to credit what? We're going to credit cash. You're saying now, hold on a second. I did not even receive the cash yet. Why am I spending cash? Because you did incur the cash on the program. You expended the $30,000. Now bear in mind, this is a revenue expenditure type of deal. As soon as I spend the money in a reimbursement grant, I can recognize the revenue. Now, what do I need to do? I was reimbursed immediately for $20,000. So the state government gave me $20,000. That's good. They promised to pay me the rest in January, which is 60 days after year end. So I have a grant receivable, which I can recognize because it's 60 days within year end. And now I recognize the revenue from grant. $30,000. So notice this is what we called revenue expenditure entry. So basically we recorded the expenditure and the expenditure triggered the revenue. So it's revenue expenditure. Basically all what we did is we grossed up the income statement basically. Okay, because now we have more revenues and more expenses on the income statement. Let's look at 2019. In 2019, the city expended the remaining $120,000. Well, and was reimbursed by the state for the 10 from 2018 and the amount spent in 2019. Now what we did is we spent another $120,000. And what else happened is the government gave us the fund that they promised to pay us. In other words, they promised to pay us the $10,000 from the prior year. They did it. And they reimbursed us for the $20,000 in 2019. So for 2019, once again, we need to first record the expenditure, which in turn, in these type of grants, they trigger the revenue recognition. I mean, this sounds funny. You have to spend the money in order to be able to recognize the revenue. Hopefully this makes sense. And notice, it's the same thing that we did earlier. Same exact thing. Before we recognize the revenue, notice here, we recorded the expenditure before we recognize the revenue. And we're going to have to do basically The same thing here. Before we recognize the revenue, we have to incur the expenditure. Okay, so this is for the 120,000. Now also they said they paid us the $10,000, so let's do this separately. So we have a receivable, grant receivable, so we're gonna debit cash, 10,000, credit, grant receivable for 10,000. And what's that for? This entry for this grant receivable, because we recorded the grant receivable the prior year. Now we need to go ahead and record the fund. And obviously, what else do we have to do? We have to also record the reimbursement for this entry. So we're going to debit cash 120 and credit revenue from grant. $120, and here's what we did. We recorded now the revenue. So it's interesting to see that in a reimbursement grant, what triggers the revenue is the expenditure. So first we have to spend the money. Now suppose instead that the city received the entire 150 in cash at the time of the award was announced in 2017. Now, how much revenue should the city recognize in its governmental fund in each of the 3 period explain? Now, what we're saying is this. Let's assume that we receive the money up front. Okay, what does it mean up front? It means when they announce the grant, they send us the money. Said, here's the money. We give you the grant. Okay, so what would happen in 2017? Well, in 2017. Obviously, we receive the cash. We'll debit cash for 150,000, and we will credit deferred grant revenue for 150,000. This is what would happen. Okay. Now the revenue will take place the same way as we saw, for example. In year 1, we recognized revenue of 30,000, except that we don't need the cash anymore. We don't need the cash. What we do, we debit deferred revenue because we already received the cash. And in that situation, we will not have a receivable because we already have the cash. So we will debit deferred revenue for 30,000. Same thing for the 2019. We will not have cash. Obviously, this entry will not exist because we will not have a receivable. Then we will not have cash. We will debit deferred revenue. Okay, and by doing so, we eliminated the 150,000 of deferred revenue. So it's interesting to see how this works if they gave us the money up front. Okay. Now, suppose alternatively, the state awarded the city an unrestricted grant, which is the city elected to use to support the adult literacy program. The city received the entire 150 in cash at the time of the award. At the time the award was announced. How much revenue should the city recognize in its governmental fund statement in each of the 3 years? Well, now notice, now this is a totally different type of grant. Unrestricted fund, unrestricted grant, you'll be able to recognize in the period they are announced. Okay, so what happened in 2017 now, because the grant is totally different, you will debit cash 150 and credit revenue from grant, or grant revenue from grant 150. So under the third scenario, you can immediately, not immediately, but once you receive the cash, since it's unrestricted, well, it's revenue to you. And hopefully you understand the different type. This is, we went through various scenarios of how government account for different grant. It all depends on the type of the grant. So you have to know the type of the grant that you are giving. Is it purpose restricted, time restricted? What type of grant are we looking for? Is it unrestricted? Okay, this is a good example. If you have any questions, any comments, email me and work hard.